see.
Oh no, perhaps I can.
Recording. There we go.
Okay.
So, recording now. Great.
Great. Okay. Well,
shall I quickly introduce you?
yeah, go for it.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us for the latest T3 lecture stroke seminar, the April edition, and 1 week after the third Thursday. So this month we're joined by my good friend Dyfrig, who is going to be delivering a seminar entitled "In Soviet Russia, Text Read You," and it's with a little bit of a subtitle, I suppose, of when you read something, are you reading the same thing as me, and what might that mean for doing theology or history?
I assume it is. That's where it would happen.
So I couldn't work out who's saying. Was that you, Dyfrig, or Chris?
No. Was that you, Chris?
Oh, that's weird. I could hear something in the background.
How strange.
Never mind, but over to you, Dyfrig. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thank you, Lev. What I wanted to do tonight, it's not so much a lecture as a discussion, I think, and prompting some ideas and talking things through that interest me, and seeing what other people think. I wanted to start with a little bit of an experiment, and I'm hoping, Lev, that you have the thing I sent through for sharing. Do you have that ready for us?
Yes. In fact, what I'll do is yeah, but you've caught me on holiday because it was when I thought Andy was going to be joining us, I thought he was going to be able to.
Right.
So, actually, no, he's unable to join us. So what I'll do is I'll quickly get it up on the relevant screen.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see if I can get it online. Okay, so 1 second. Just loading up the Gmail. Dyfrig. It's currently searching. Come on. It's still thinking. Sorry about that. You did say that because of the. There we go. Okay, right. So I've got it now. So if I go share application. Friend, can you see that?
Oh yeah, but I can also probably recite it.
Okay, great.
And that might be helpful actually, because I don't know if Chris is able to see the screen, so maybe, and it would also benefit me obviously because I can't see the screen at all. If could you possibly read it out?
Yeah.
Please.
I have seen the sun break through to illuminate a small field for a while and gone my way and forgotten it. But that was the pearl of great price, the one field that had treasure in it. I realize now that I must give all that I have to possess it. Life is not hurrying on to a receding future nor hankering after an imagined past. It is the turning aside, like Moses to the miracle of the burning bush. Sorry, it says lit. Like Moses to the miracle of the lit bush, to a brightness that seemed as transitory as your youth once, but is the eternity that awaits you.
Right, so that's a poem. We can tell it's a poem because the lines don't reach the edge of the page. I was just going to ask, firstly, people's reactions to it. There's no right answer to this. Just could be anything about the poem, just how you react to the poem on first hearing and reading it.
Well, I think I've heard of the Pearl of Great Price before, but I don't think I've ever read the poem associated with it. I'm assuming this is it.
Oh, interesting.
It struck me as something that I kind of like an illumination of mind, where I've heard that some mystics or monks and nuns or people who have broken through to a profound spirituality have this kind of sense of centerness and oneness and unity with time and creation, and it kind of reminded me of that kind of transcendent kind of life. Yeah, that's my first reaction to it.
Wow, that's really interesting. What was your reaction to it, apart from you can recite it?
Oh, I've seen this one before.
Mm-hmm.
It's what you pick when you've forgotten to prep something for evening worship. Not you personally, like literally everybody. It's well, it happens that it's picking up my favourite set of parables. So it happens it's my favourite bit of Matthew. And yeah, I've led quite a few services using this, and I've been to even more services using this as the way to get people to think about what matters. I love the idea that the important thing happened over there and you missed it, and then you realise you didn't miss it, but now it's too late, you can't grab hold of it again, and you spend forever chasing it.
That's really interesting. I don't know if Chris is in a position to be able to type something in the box.
Chris said he could see it,
right?
Which is a good start.
Yeah, that's great. If you do have any thoughts, Chris, you're. Oh.
Sorry, I'm falling off your chair.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry.
No, it's fine.
if you've got any thoughts, Chris, feel free to pop them in, because it'd be really interesting to hear how you encounter the poem, especially as you're in a different country, or all of us are here in the same country. I thought people's responses were really, really interesting, because they were so different. I mean, Fred, you were talking about encountering it in a church context and its use in a church context, and playing off of biblical ideas. And Lev, you were picking up on a mystical and this notion of the pearl as some sort of a consciousness thing, which was really, really fascinating. I have a very different reaction to this poem, and that's because of where I grew up and of the languages I speak. Does anybody know whose poem this is?
R.S. Thomas.
R.S. Thomas. He was a Welsh Anglican priest and writer, but he wrote in English. He learned Welsh in adulthood, and because I speak Welsh and therefore was able to study Welsh literature at A level, I know that the title of this poem, which we didn't put up on the screen, the title is actually The Bright Field. And I know, because of what I know, that the title, and especially the opening part of the poem, is riffing directly off another poem by a Welsh poet called Waldo Williams.
Was he the one who would strike a top and everyone in the room has to look for him?
That's right. Waldo Williams was a poet, and he was a Quaker and pacifist. He refused to pay his taxes during the Korean War because he opposed the Korean War, and so hence the question, where's Waldo? He's in prison. But anyway,
hang on. Is that true?
The bit about him going to prison is true.
Okay.
Playing the game, no, it's not true. No. So and the poem that R.S. Thomas here is riffing off is called Into Fields, Mewn Dau Gai, and it's about Waldo Williams is describing in quite intense and complex terms a mystical experience he had. But he's thinking of it positively as something that was of changed him positively, and he had the experience, whereas Thomas is saying, seems to be saying, yes, I saw the light burst through, but I didn't turn aside and I didn't have the experience. There's also an element, because Waldo Williams's religious sensibilities were tied up with his sense of place, of living in Southwest Wales, and of culture, of is a big mover and shaker within the Welsh language community. That it's not neither his poem nor Thomas's are about just religion. There's an element of the almost quasi-mystical elements of and romantic elements of language and nationalism and things like that. So when I see this poem, there's all that stuff going on. And I also, when I was preparing this, and reading over the poem, it struck me, the second half of it isn't very good as poetry.
It's not true. It's still really short on the line.
It just feels like some sentences put together rather than crafted, which is odd, because I like R.S. Thomas's poems a lot, but I just don't think this is one of his best. But there we are. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that we've all reacted to this text in very, very different ways, bringing to it all sorts of things. Now, and I think what we bring is illustrative of different ways we deal with. It's possible to read the Bible and other, or it could be with any text, but specifically we're talking in T3 perhaps about how we look at scripture. So clearly my version is right, because I've got all the facts about the historical context. I know things, biographical information about the author. I know the political and cultural context in which he was writing, and I understand the allusions better than all of you do that he's making. So clearly mine's correct, and there is no other possible reading. Fryn brings to it, I suppose, how the poem she's encountered is being used and in a particular context, aren't you? It's you've come across this poem in the way it's used.
The intertext.
You brought the intertext, yes.
I brought this text in the ways I've met it in culture, rather than this text in the ways it's situated in time. Yeah.
Had you come across the poem before, Lev, at all, or was this the first time you've found it?
I don't believe so, unless I have in the distant past and forgotten it.
Yeah.
It certainly felt fresh to me.
Yeah. So in a way, you were responding to its almost immediate effect, the things that first struck you. You were responding to its content, rather than any ideas about any ideas Fryn or I would have brought to it. Now, you may think, well, that's obvious, isn't it? And we're probably true, and I think we're done. Yeah, there we go. No, I suppose what I want to explore is there are different ways. Say we're looking at a piece of scripture. We use scripture a lot in church. We have it read out, and we listen to it. We may have some of it commented on in a sermon, and we may some people might get together and look at specific passages in a study. But what are we doing with the text when we do that? I think our three different reactions, in quite fortuitous way, I think help illustrate three ways of reading that people might take. So one might sit with the Bible, just open it and see what it says and respond to the word. Well, they might,
no one does that.
Well,
that's not a real thing.
Okay. But if you've never read the Bible before, you might open it and just read it, wouldn't you? Possibly.
No one just reads anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain that?
Even the very first book you tried to read, the one in which there's just a picture of a child bouncing a ball and the word ball on it, you're never reading outside of the context of existing symbols and existing story and narrative and meaning making. So you're never just reading the Bible.
Okay. So
yeah. So, like, words are already carrying stuff. Nothing's pristine. There's no. You might get your first go at reading a specific text, but you're not reading context free.
Right. That's what you mean. Yeah. So you might come across a text for the first time, but you're still reading with
culture.
With culture. Yeah.
Okay. And yourself.
Yes. Yeah. And that was I suppose that's the other things. I bring knowledge of a cultural knowledge of the poem to it, and I, in a sense, I can never read it without all of that, even though possibly that makes me less inclined to like it very much as a poem, because to me it reads very differently from the way it's been used. I think the Bright Field was even used as a title for Greenbelt one year. And I think to me the poem is a very, very different thing than some people gathering in a tent in a field in the middle of England. It's a very specifically different poem to me. So when I prepare sermons, I know I have to go through a process of clearing away a lot of rubbish. I have to basically write a terrible sermon about random ideas about the context and the political background of the meaning of a passage, and interesting intellectual puzzles in the sermon that have caught my attention. I had to clear all that away, I had to work through that in order to actually write something that might be of interest or help to anybody else. And I think that's possibly because of, I think I first got into studying the Bible in a very there must be an answer sort of way. There must be an explanation for what this passage is and what it's doing. And that's, I think that's just weird, the way my default position is to think there is a solvable puzzle here, or there is an explanation that can be got at. But that's just me. A lot of the better sermons I've heard are not like that. A lot of people will take an idea from a sermon, from a text, and use it to explore a wider world rather than just explore the meaning of the use of a semicolon in a verse somewhere in Zephaniah. I'd find that very interesting, but most people won't. So I'll just pause there to to see how do people think they approach a text when they're doing it? Are they conscious of what they do and how they think they do it?
No small question.
No small question, no.
What do you do, Lev?
So before I answer, I just want to say that whilst you were talking, Chris did make a comment in the chat saying, I'm always drawn to interplay between the immediate and the mediate.
Yeah.
I feel that in this poem. And then he follows it by saying, sorry, but I may not be able to respond promptly. So we hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, thanks, Chris.
So if I recall correctly, the question was, how do you approach a text? A biblical text, I assume.
We can start with biblical text, given that we're in T3. But you know, if you want to, you know, if you want to draw that out into other things as well, that's fine.
Actually, yes, I can probably give an answer that applies to both biblical and non-biblical texts. Actually, certainly in the last 5 to 10 years, since the explosion of social media, there's the where information and opinion is exchanged laterally and horizontally rather than vertically. There's almost a kind of a democratization of knowledge and information and data, where instead of it trickling down from trusted institutions such as broadcasters, the fourth estate of mainstream kind of newspapers and the government or other institutions like the church or the monarchy, what have you, information is now available to be accessed across the internet from all sorts of different sources. And I think that since that advent in the last, certainly in the last 10 years or so, people have developed or certainly been reminded to develop certain critical thinking skills. So checking the sources, checking the biases, fact checking. And I think this has been very useful for anyone who regularly spends any time on the internet, to be able to acquire those skills and to critically analyze where this information is coming from. And of course, when Trump kind of kept on using the phrase fake news, there was almost like a struggle over the idea of truth and facts. And it was quite interesting, actually, that this phenomenon of fake news in the last 5 or so years has been so fought over. What is the truth, in my view? And it's forced people who discuss opinion or news on the internet to critically analyze. And so if it's a biblical text or a news item, the first thing I'll do is try to find a little bit of information about the author, who wrote it, or if they're part of an organization. And if they are part of an organization, does that organization have, well, I shouldn't say does it have, but I should say what biases does it have? I think N.T. Wright said all information or texts are biased. You can't escape having any. But he used the example of he's a Newcastle United fan, and so when he reads the back pages of the local newspaper in Newcastle to find out how the team is doing, he would expect the newspaper to give a pro Newcastle United story, but he wouldn't expect it to get the scores wrong. So he is making the point that whilst all texts contain biases, you would hope the most reliable ones get the facts right. And so unless it's and there are sources out there which deliberately spread misinformation and do get the facts wrong, but the more credible and reliable sources don't. And it's a question of trying to figure out what source you're reading. Is it a reliable and credible one, or is it one that is deliberately spreading misinformation? And I suppose when it comes to ancient texts, you could give the example of the Acts of Peter, which is a genre of romances, and it quite clearly has made up a lot of information. It's a lot of the account is fictitious, but because it is sprinkled with some truth, the task of disentangling fact from fiction is a little bit more complicated. But in the case of something like the Gospel of Mark, it seems that it was at least trying to convey a truthful and accurate and credible picture of, or a biography of Jesus. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
Interesting. Thank you. What do you do?
Oh,
You've got a PhD in this, so.
so my first degree is in English literature, and I spent a lot of time thinking about how you read stuff. And when they taught us about the death of the author, which is an idea by Roland Barthes, who was trying to deconstruct reading and explain what we're doing when we're reading. He says that the author doesn't matter at all. The author's irrelevant to the understanding of a text, and that's quite a major break in terms of 20th century ways of reading modern texts. So the pursuit of the author and the author's opinion and the author's original meaning were being highlighted as vain pursuits. They were not, you couldn't recover it. You could recover things and call them that. You could follow the trail of facts and the clues to identity. You could look at how that person is situated in time and place, and you could construct theories from all of those details, but you still never recover the author meaningfully, and therefore you can't use the author to explain the reading of the text that you're making.
So I can't rely on what I was saying, these things I know about R.S. Thomas to explain that point.
No.
Yeah.
They're not irrelevant, but they don't have ultimate power over a text, which in the way that literary theory was done before that, they did. My background is ancient texts, and whether that's ancient English texts, so Old English, unauthored texts from the early medieval period, and Old Testament texts where we rarely have the author, and the few texts for which we have a claimed author are probably not by him. So, texts ascribed to Jeremiah are probably not literally penned by Jeremiah, however interesting he and his body of teaching is to the people who wrote it down. And so I'm looking at what the text does when I'm reading it, but I'm very conscious that by reading it, I'm changing it. Okay. And I love that idea. There's a French feminist literary theorist called Hélène Cixous, and she put in one of her essays that writing is always positing meaning and always evaporating it. So that every time you read a text, you'll get something new out of it. Every passing over a text adds detail or changes perspective. It doesn't ever stay still. And I think the reason it doesn't stay still is because the reader doesn't stay still. And the context of reading doesn't stay still. And I think that's why when you've read a book and then watched something on TV, it never matches up. You can't go back to the same product twice. You can't read a murder mystery as though you don't know the ending. For example, the second time you read something, you have a sense of the trajectory. It's never the same.
Yes, you're spotting the clues that were there.
So that's how I approach texts, conscious that I'm changing them, and yet terribly interested in them. I love reading texts, and I love thinking through what meaning making I can make out of them, and what meaning making other people have made out of them. But they don't stay put.
Gosh,
Finished.
that's quite big. Thank you. Yeah. That, I think, one of the things I struggle with, I think, is the notion of how we know this. No, let's start again. How we know something is true. Now, this is not just about what's written down or in a text. I suppose it's a much broader question than that. But something interesting you said, Lev, that we can say is it the Acts of Peter you were referring to? That's we can say that's a romance and that's made up. Whereas Mark, we can say this is something that's definitely trying to tell us something truthful about the life of Jesus, about what happened. And I was wondering, what is it that makes it possible for us to make that judgment? Because there will be some who say, well, Mark's just made it up. There's nothing inherent in the Gospel of Mark to say this definitely happened, because how do we know? What we've got is the Gospel of Mark. So I'd be interested. You were saying, what is it when you read the Gospel Acts of Peter? What is it that may persuade you that this is not true, whereas Mark is true?
I'm not an expert on genre studies. I only kind of loosely understand the concepts behind it, but I understand that when examining a literary text, you can look for certain patterns or themes or signals within it that fit within a recognized genre. And although the identification over the genre of Mark has been fought over, I think the most common identification is that it's an ancient biography. That is contested, of course, but there are the most common classification is it's a biography. And when constructing a biography, although sometimes biographers will use a certain amount of artistic license to perhaps clarify or present the story in a certain light, they will ultimately try to get at the gist of what this person's life was about. They will try to present it in such a way that is in accordance with the most accurate or commonly held kind of view or assessment of that person. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that it's every single word spoken or every single action happened, but it's just how people remember. And so it is through a lens, and that lens has probably emphasized or de-emphasized certain aspects of that person's life, but nevertheless it does attempt to portray as an accurate picture as possible.
So same kind of question, but a different not gospel. I spent some time studying the Gospel of Nicodemus, in which Jesus harrows hell for a few days, and it answers the question, well, what was he doing between the crucifixion and the resurrection? And why would you say, reading that text, that it doesn't have the same status as the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Luke. And partly it is the level of coherence it holds as a single story. The histories that are closer in time to the life of Jesus struggle with material that doesn't bend well to the storyteller's perspective. And the Gospel of Nicodemus doesn't. It's got one really nice through line.
It's too coherent.
It's also got lots of things that are about proving truth. It's got lots of things that are inherent proofs of its own truthiness.
Okay.
Which comes across as really suspicious. So handily, God sent back a pair of twins who were mute, who were taken to different locations, who transcribed their identical testimony onto parchment. So there's lots of things showing that those people didn't collude, that they did reach the standard of legal evidencing of the day, that their accounts are identical, but that there's definitely no collusion in the generating of the account. And they are warranted for, they're placed into the gospel narrative as people known to Nicodemus. I think they might be his own adult sons.
Right.
There's things about how when Jesus enters the temple, all of the flags poles bend down to worship him.
Right.
There's things about how the Roman authorities have caused Romans to lie so that the truth of the crucifixion and resurrection will not be known. So there's lots of things that are about demonstrating the truth claim, and it's answering fundamentally a question of a gap.
Right.
Whereas the histories, Mark being a nice example, end with gaps.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah.
they have to live with the gaps that are created from the account that is available to the person who compiled them. Yeah. And you can feel places where it feels like a gap is being bridged, but they don't successfully bridge everything.
No.
So that's one of the things, the sense that this piece of work is demonstrating features that would suggest somebody was really concerned with its truthiness. And then other things like in time, there's no evidence for it at any time early. You know, it doesn't seem to exist till the 5th century. So
there are clues in the content and in the presence of the text in history.
The manuscript tradition.
Another reason why I think the Gospel of Mark contains fairly accurate and credible information is due to external attestation. So you've got the account delivered by Papias of the Apostle John, purportedly the Apostle John, although that's fiercely contested whether he was the Apostle John. But certainly someone called John told Papias, according to Papias, that and this John seems to have known Mark, that Mark wrote down accurately the sayings and deeds of Jesus, but not necessarily in the right order, because he didn't.
Excellent.
So this is so it seems that John is saying to Papias that he was a follower of Jesus. He followed him in his ministry. He was a disciple, because he says that Mark wasn't a follower. So he didn't get the order right, but because he was a translator of Peter, he got all the stories from Peter, who was a follower of Jesus. And so in the anecdotes and snippets of information about Jesus that Peter would deliver in his sermons, Mark would be standing next to him translating it from Aramaic to Greek. And of course he remembered these things. And so when the Roman Church beseeched him to write a gospel of Jesus, he just took his memory of what Peter had been discussing about Jesus and compiled a gospel. But of course it wasn't necessarily in the right chronological order, because John, who was there and read presumably Mark's gospel, thought, hang on, it's right, but it's in the wrong place. So the external attestation from someone who is a witness of Jesus' life, who'd read the Gospel of Mark and could verify the individual pericopes or sayings and deeds. And I think that's really important in its verification of truth.
We could go to so many places because both what you said is so interesting. I'd like to follow up every single nook and cranny, but we probably haven't got the time or the energy for that. Does that mean, I suppose that leads on to the other aspect of the sort of subtitle for tonight, not just about theology and the Bible, but about history. If a text is like, was it Helen Sissou?
Mhm.
Yeah, you know, it evaporates. I'm sorry, I'm distracted by the fact that the name Sissou has made me think of that Wes Anderson film about, is it Steve Sissou, the Life Aquatic with Steve Sissou, but I don't think that's the same thing. If the text changes and evaporates, when we're trying to reconstruct
If it helps,
history,
it's not the text that evaporates, it's meaning.
it's meaning that evaporates, right?
Text.
Okay, the meaning evaporates, right?
Writing is always making meaning,
Yeah,
and it's always evaporating meaning.
right. Can we construct a truthful picture of anything if all we've got is text?
No.
No. Okay.
But that doesn't mean we can't create meaning structures that are useful to us, just that we can't capture truthful once and for all.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I would say. That it's not that you can't have continuity of thought across time either. We do, but that you don't get to lock down the one unifying and permanent meaning of a thing. Unless you're God, you might very much get to do so if you're a deity, but we aren't.
So does that leave, I suppose where I'm getting to is, does that leave everything up to the reader to determine what's true? You know, is it now I don't think it's true. I think there are things we can say are true. I don't think that many of them, but I think, you know, we can. But I'm also aware these are accumulations of evidence, of understanding and sifting. For example, I think the order of events of things that happened in Britain from about 1066 to the present day, I think we can generally say certain things happen after each other in a particular order. But if you asked 3 different historians, for example, say Winston Churchill, Simon Schama, and Mary Beard, what those things signify, I think then you'd get into different, you know, there would be difference, because history isn't just one damn thing after another. It's actually what people say about the one damn thing after another. So I am very conscious that there's a tension between the fact that we're trying to find out things that are true, but we are part of the process of making it true, or at least extracting that truth. That we have, going back to where we began, we have the poem, and the poem is there, but we've all got different things out of the poem. for varying different reasons. And I suspect that listening to each other's responses to the poem will possibly make us think about the poem differently the next time we read it. Now, I find that I've realised that that's quite a difficult thing to hold together, because something like Christianity makes truth claims. It makes claims about how people are. It sometimes makes claims about how they should behave, and about the sources of what we know. And so I find that, you know, I find holding those two things very difficult, or not difficult. I'm very conscious of holding those two things together. That Christianity, or, you know, if you have a religious conviction, that's something that is created by people, in terms of the things we look at, how we look at them, how we understand them. But I can see that as a sort of logical argument, not logical argument, but as a way of speaking about truth, that's quite hard, because somebody could turn around and say, well, you're just making that up. And that's something I always find an attention in myself when I'm thinking about not just religion, but also, you know, the other things I'm interested in history and in law. You know, I'm very conscious that law is just something we make. You know, people make law. Some of them might be very good laws, some of them might be very bad laws, but they are there and are put into practice because people put them into practice. You know, there's a slight circularity about it.
So you were asking about history, and thinking about the news in Britain today, which was in part around an apology for weird memorialisation of particular participants in the World Wars. I don't know if any of you know when World War I ended. When did World War I stop?
Are you asking when the fighting stopped and the armistice occurred? If that's what you're asking, then I would say 1918.
Specifically? Go on, Dyfrig, you'd
Well,
like to commit to an answer.
Armistice was the 11th of November 1918.
Yeah, so we mark the end of World War I on the 11th of November every year, because we know that the armistice for World War I happened on the 11th of November in 1918. But the fighting didn't stop. Not least there's some people who didn't know in Europe, so the message doesn't get to them, so there's a little bit of blowing up happens after the armistice. But literally the war in Africa isn't over. It goes on for a bit longer. So although the European cessation of fighting takes place around the 11th of November, and by the 12th it's sort of over, the fighting goes on for quite a bit longer. But if you were asked to ask local populations, when did the war stop? Do they count that as the day that the legal ceasefire stopped, or the day that the soldiers went home, or the point where their economic functioning is intact again? You know, what do you mark as the end of a war? That's the kind of question that shapes history in a big way. And that's why history is as subject to repeated meaning making as reading the biblical text is. History is not static. It is read and changed person by person and generation on generation and context. You can't read the history of the industrial area the same if you learnt it at school where I did in the north of England in the 1990s, as if you're studying it now in the Caribbean, very mindful of the impact of plantation life on the economy for generations and centuries after. It's not, there's no pristine text of facts. Just like there's no pristine text of scripture, even if the letters stop moving, which they don't. The closer you study scripture, the more you realise the actual literal words at the bottom are contested. Which is the most fun bit. Every text in my PhD had one major textual problem. And that's probably one of the things that keeps people interested, is that you can't lock down even the base text, let alone the meaning of the base text.
I think that's really helpful.
Hey guys, I just wanted to pop in with my voice.
Hi, Chris.
There was something you were talking about earlier of like how we could relate to texts that we're not really connected to, that's several hundred years old. Are we culturally connected to it? And I think that's a bit more of a complicated answer than you would think, right? Because it's, if you find some text from another civilization that is, 600 years old, and you somehow manage to translate it, you got some form of a Rosetta Stone that allows you to translate it, even though you don't have a cultural relations to these people. Can you read it? And I think the answer is absolutely you can. You're going to miss certain cultural relevances, right? And you're definitely going to be putting your own personal bias on it. But one of the advantages that you actually have is that you don't have a lot of baggage outside of yourself, right? So you can sort of approach this thing with sort of new eyes. They're definitely your biased eyes, but with new eyes. On the other hand, that scenario I just described doesn't actually match most of the text that we would be talking about in a situation like this, whether it's an older religious text or an older philosophical text, in my neck of the woods. Even if there were several hundred years or a few hundred years of disappearance, between when that text was written and when it kind of showed up in our cultural sphere, it doesn't change the fact that there's also probably a couple hundred years of cultural connection to it after its discovery to now, right? So you might find, a Christian text that, disappeared for a couple hundred years, then popped up around, 1500. I'm just making stuff up, right? That disappears around 1500. Well, if it popped back up at about 1500, there's still, 500 years of cultural commentary in placement, from then to now. So, is there a separation between that text and your cultural context? Probably not, because you're probably very much looking at it from those 500 years perspective. It's difficult. Like I think, so I often teach introduction to philosophy, and you take someone like Plato, and Plato is in no way a European Christian white male, but it's very hard to get students not to read him that way.
Right.
Yeah, because there's that cultural separation. I mean, there's literally a dark ages between us and him, of lost information. But there's also now, closing in on the 1,000 years of him being interpreted as a Christian white male that is there. So it's interesting because you can, even if you lose connection on the back end, there's still a lot of context on the front end that people have sort of added on. So it's a loaded question. But yeah. There's also you were giving your just like, if I could hog up 30 more seconds, you were giving your war example of when it ends, and it always cracks me up that the most famous battle of the War of 1812 between our two great nations was the battle of New Orleans. And the greatest battle of the War of 1812 was in January of 1815, right? And like you'll, so I mean, you always have those problems.
Oh,
but
that
just
makes
my
my day.
yeah.
I'm gonna
We
go
don't
look that up now.
study that much.
No,
because of not winning it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
we don't think about that one. No.
Yeah. No one won that one. It was a pissing match, but
When I
I'll shut
studied
up now.
history, it kind of went Egyptians and Romans, stuff that happened around the Normans, couple of
Yeah.
bit kings and queens, Industrial Revolution, but only in Britain.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And then you kick back in 1875, and resolutely there is no first half of the 19th century. There just isn't one. There's nothing happens before the Corn Laws.
and then the Nazis. Isn't
Yeah.
it? Yeah. I don't know how history is taught over there, Chris, but yeah, pretty much.
Not effectively, but yeah.
Chris, didn't we torch the White House in 1812?
Yeah, I think that would have been in 1813. I'd have to check. I don't remember when that was. Yeah, it was not our finest moment. No one's finest moment, really.
There were good people on both sides.
Yeah.
Very
That's what I hear.
fun.
People people are crazy about running 5Ks over here, like 5K, like foot races, because it's a good distance. You don't have to be in great shape to do it. And a couple of years ago, well, several years ago now, but starting several years ago, but for a few years in a row, somebody was doing a run from the Redcoats 5K, and it was on the day of the anniversary of the Redcoat burning of the White House.
Okay.
So the idea was that people were actually dressing up in sort of like theme appropriate gear and were being chased by some Redcoats for their 5K. So it was pointless, but I fear by showing up I've thrown us far afield of the conversation. So
No, I think
No.
that's great to hear him. Great to hear from you. Yeah. I don't think I've got any more I wanted to explore. I found that a really interesting and stimulating discussion. So if people want to continue talking, that's great. But I've got no further prompts at this stage. What people think. I mean, what your reflections are there, and what we've talked about.
Yeah, I also found it very stimulating and interesting, that exchange we've just had. And you started off by asking about how we can discover truth, and when you asked that, I immediately thought, at the risk of sounding like Pontius Pilate, I'd like to ask, what is truth?
Yes.
And Steve Tompkins and I were having a brief exchange on Facebook about this recently, and he proposed there are different categories of truth, with some categories easier to obtain, and others much more difficult. And I think he had like mathematics and science and at one end, the more obtainable, and history kind of like in the middle, and theological beliefs kind of at the other end.
I think that the closer you look at science, genuinely look at it, so the deeper you get, the more it resembles theology or philosophy. So the closer you look at the tiny structures in the universe, the tiniest things, the less they resemble how we thought they worked. And I'm pretty confident that if we were to jump 500 years in the future, that what we've understood about that now will turn out to be very much unlike how things actually work. The more you look at the big structures, we keep filling in the theories we have around the big structures of the universe, but they're mostly conjecture, that are good conjecture based on the available data, but they're conjecture. And And a lot of what we're doing in applied science is looking at ways to extrapolate a good enough picture to get on with something.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So can you use calculations to infill bits of data without measuring the data? Because it would be awfully handy if you could. Which means that the fact you end up with at the end, the piece of data at the end, is actually based on conjecture, not reality. And if you get it right, you have good conjecture and you get a fact that's good enough to rely upon.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's not so different from the way that the arts treat facts.
Mm-hmm.
So, my dad's a physicist and made us spend our childhood reciting things like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. And that's the idea that if you've got a particle on a trajectory and you decide to measure its speed, the way you do that is by bouncing another particle off it. Well, that's changed its trajectory of travel.
Mm-hmm.
If instead you decide to measure the other one, so if you measure trajectory one way or you measure speed, you either change the trajectory or change the speed.
In the act of measuring.
Yeah, in the act of measuring, you change the other things. You can't measure both at the same time. So there's always a degree of uncertainty because the act of reading the text of the particle changes it.
Yeah.
I realise that's me doing a literary thing to physics.
Yeah.
I'm very conscious of that. But actually, there's something fundamental in what we like to call facts, which is that they're rarely absolutely solid. They're either best knowledge theories or data, but data requires interpretation.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something's just.
Yeah, if I could. Oh.
So go ahead, Chris.
Okay.
Oh.
If I could step a second.
Yep, I think I see frozen.
Oh, you're back, Dyfrig.
Right.
Chris is back now. Oh, he's frozen again.
We're not actually frozen, we're just being really still. I'm just going to keep a hand moving now from now on, so you'll know.
I'll keep my thumbs twiddling. This is an indication that
you're out of shot. My webcam is designed to not show that you're crocheting during the meeting, so your hands are out of shot.
So something that struck me when you was talking about physics and the closer you look at science, the more strange things happen. And when I was learning about quantum physics like a few years ago, just the very basic kind of arguments behind it, that it was quite astonishing to learn that the act of observing actually changes like how certain particles behave and stuff. And I was speculating about whether that is true of just humans or whether it's true of any other life form. Perhaps in the act of reconciling creation to himself, God did something very exciting to creation, where creation itself took on certain powers that only the deity or God would usually be reserved for. In other words, humanity or all of creation itself, whatever it is, just by being, just by observing, has some kind of powerful control over the universe that it finds itself in.
Wow.
There's this really interesting kind of line in a couple of ancient texts. One is Ignatius and another one is a text of hardly anyone knows about. It's called Eusebius Concerning the Star. It's the one I took to the, it's in the British Library. It's about 1,500 years old, and I managed to get them to subject it to infrared spectrum analysis to recover some erased text and stuff.
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah.
You remember? Yeah.
But within that and Ignatius, they both make the point that when at the moment of the crucifixion, the powers of witchcraft and sorcery and other kind of powers that the pagan gods were thought to have ceased at that point. And I think Paul makes a similar point, and I think Colossians, where powers and principalities were humiliated or on the cross. It seems certainly in Christian circles, there was this recognition that there was this time where the world was subject to the certain non-godly powers, pagan powers. And after the crucifixion and resurrection, that all changed. I just wonder whether, you know, John says, you know, in 1 John, I think it is, that the whole world, Christ died not just for us, but for the whole world. I wonder if Christ's crucifixion and resurrection actually altered the framework of how the universe works. Fundamentally altered it.
That is such an interesting thought. I think quite a powerful thought.
It made me think of, there's a concept in Orthodox Christianity of theosis, which is being taken up into God. You know,
Is it like the godly opposite of kenosis?
possibly, yes. But if I knew what kenosis was.
That's the emptying out of the
Oh, right, yeah, could be.
of Christ on the self.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's extrapolated from it. There's a line in one of the letters of Peter, I think, about this is where this concept seems to come from, so that people participate in the life of God by, you know, once whatever the crucifixion is about, once that happens, or once the resurrection happens, and we accept the resurrection, then we are taken up into God. We are changed into, not quite changed into God, but kinda. But so the, yeah, but going back to sort of the idea of observing changes the thing observed. You know, if God has looked at us, have we changed? And if the universe looks at God, does that change God? That's an interesting one. Goodness, didn't expect to get there.
I'm going to have to step out. I'll leave you three
Yeah,
to it.
sure. Okay.
Good to see you again.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've also discovered the Wikipedia page on epistemology.
Right.
Epistemology apparently is the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge.
Yeah.
And by extension, truth, logic, metaphysics, ethics, rationality of belief. And I had no idea that it's so involved, and there's so much depth to the study of.
Yeah, that's a massive subject. I mean, how do you know what you know is always, how do you validate knowledge is it's massive. I think one of the things that people need to step away from, unfortunately, the modern era, did a lot of things right, but one of the things that it did wrong is it came up with this concept that if we get our thought process right, then there's no difference between fact and truth.
Right.
And unfortunately, they were wrong about that. And
is that a fact, or is that just true?
It's both. Because for example, right now, you're looking into a camera on a laptop, I'm presuming, right, which is sitting on top of something.
Yeah.
Now that thing that it's sitting on top of exists, right? It has factual existence. It has properties that we can define in certain ways and measure. It doesn't need our mind to exist. We can wish it away in our mind, but if we walk towards it, we're going to thud into it, right? And all of that is factual. On the other hand, what makes it a desk is a matter of truth and not fact, right? Our conceptual understanding of it is what is true or what is false. Those any characteristics that can be measured that are independent of us are factual, right? So they're not the same, and that's one of the things we've had to recover, from the modern thinkers.
Yeah. I think
so. There's a difference.
I think that there seems to be a lot of stuff coming out now. I mean, I pick up on sort of popular, sort of semi-academic books. The stuff that's published to try and make sense of academic stuff that's going on in a way that normal people can understand it. And there seems to be quite a glut at the moment of looking back at especially the sort of the 18th century and saying some of the things we picked up in the 18th century get us stuck in ideas, that there is this, like you say, fact and truth are the same thing, that you can say things for absolute definite about things, and that leads you into, for example, that there's the irony that leads you into forms of fundamentalist Christianity, which uses Enlightenment method to try and prove something about, say, Enlightenment method to prove inerrancy, for example. But there seems to be not books written by people from a particularly religious bent, but people wanting to sort of explore, is this superstructure of in the Enlightenment, does it lead us into dead ends? Does it actually create lots of contradictions in itself? I don't know if that's something you've perceived from where you are, Chris, with your knowledge of the academic streams going on.
Could you tidy up that question again at the end?
Sorry, I mean, yeah. In where you're from, do you is there a lot of publishing going on at the moment about why the Enlightenment, what you were saying about the Enlightenment or modern thinking, that isn't as solid as we think it is?
Oh, I think the direct response to that is that there's still a lot of people holding on to those old ideas. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your partner's name.
Oh, sorry, Friend.
Friend.
Friend, yeah.
I think a lot of it has to go to what she's saying. About at a certain level, you just kind of accept things, even though that you're going to have something different later.
Yeah.
And some people can accept things, and knowing that they'll just discard it for whatever better thing comes along later. Right. Which you think is the obvious point that you should take, but other people aren't that willing to let go, and that they, then they're just happy to hold on to sort of a basic level of it. There was a comedian like years ago that I don't remember who it was, but he said, Einstein may be right, but it's still Newton that I'm worried about on my morning commute. Right. Because relativity is great, but I'm really concerned about two objects trying to occupy the same space at the same time. Yeah. So I think that I think that there's still a lot of, whether you're talking about, obviously not people who are seriously academically engaged in it, although we can all get tripped up in our minds, but I think a lot of, people, have a sort of public education, and I'm not trying to knock public education. I'm just going to the level that they went into, right? Of religion or science or whatever.
Yeah.
I think a lot of those common cultural ideas still have really deep roots in modernity. There was a Scottish philosopher. I always get his name wrong. Alistair McIntyre.
Right.
Because there's
That's the name. Yeah. Never read anything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he made the point that one of the things of modernity that we're still trying to get out of, and he wrote this about 100 years ago, was that, the modernity taught us that, once we had the right thought process, like once we learned how to appropriately understand things, then we would be happy, right?
Right.
And it doesn't matter if you're talking about a completely atheistic system or a completely Christian system. Almost all people equate, it to intellectual understanding, right? And that's just something that we still live in from modernity. So he was pushing more for what he considered not thought, but virtue development. Of actually developing, yourself to do certain things. But that's completely out of tune with diversity or modernity. Sorry. It's most people think that that happiness or true understanding, even people, this isn't some wacky secular atheist thing for just whatever, but people who are deeply religious to a large degree still hold to this idea that probably that being a good Christian is having the right intellectual understanding of it.
Right. Yeah.
And that's definitely a holdover.
Maybe we should get you to do something on how we know stuff.
Well, you might get a laugh out of Lev because I'm trying to do a side project with him, and he can't get me to show up because I'm ridiculously too busy.
Okay.
But I am. My schedule actually is opening up. I'm finishing up a semester here, so I can get Lev with that other project. And if you, I don't know, Lev, if you wanted me to do like an hour one on just sort of like introducing sort of the big ideas of epistemology. I'm sort of more of an ethicist by speciality as far as like my branch of philosophy, but I'm fully capable of being able to do, like, if you wanted just like a crash course on epistemology, I could do it. I think an hour is good.
Yeah, just explain it in that. It shouldn't take that long to explain, should it? Yeah.
How closely do you think you'll be able to relate it to the practice of theology?
Some of it pretty well. I mean, I think, some of it's, early roots, go back to like Plato and stuff like that, and the allegory of the cave and stuff like that. And, and that level of understanding, sort of a dual world understanding, the world of appearances versus the intellectual world. Particularly in Christianity, you could get a lot of reference and crossover because, it was in the Greek world, intellectually that, Christianity really developed into a Gentile religion, right? Early, and those ideas, like that dual world understanding is very strong in Christianity. So at some levels, I think I could, I'm sensing you're trying to judge whether it would be a good T3 topic or not.
Yeah, because T3 is essentially about theology. It's in the title, I suppose. There's a theology.
Yeah.
So whilst I'd welcome philosophical or epistemological kind of contributions, it would have to relate fairly strongly or closely with some concept of theology.
I agree. Time and place for anything. Let me take a look and maybe get back to you.
Okay. Yeah.
Sounds good.
That'd be great. but I've just noticed the time. We're now at the 1.5 hour mark, so we've reached the natural end. I don't know if you guys want to carry on any longer.
I'm going to step away because I've been on the computer all day as well. So, but I hope that was a stimulating and interesting way of thinking about it. So it certainly helped me to hear different voices, because you can get stuck in your own head with this sort of stuff. But yeah, and great to meet you, Chris. And hopefully catch up with you soon.
Thank you. It was a good talk. I appreciate it. I was expecting more of a Yakov Smirnoff reference at some point, but
well, I apologies to anybody who thought I was going to talk about Stanley Fish and Stalinist propaganda, but yeah.
Oh, there was no text in the classroom.
There was no text in the classroom. I'm sorry.
all right. Well, thank you, everyone, and and again, thanks for inviting me, Lev, and I better go get back to work.
Welcome, Chris, and I'll just formally end it. I want to just thank you again, Dyfrig, for such a stimulating seminar today. It's really got my synapses in my brain kind of working overtime.
Oh, good.
Very stimulating and a very interesting and worthwhile seminar. So thank you very much for your contribution and your efforts today. It's really appreciated. Next month, I'm going to try and stick to the third Thursday. I think I'll probably take it this time next month. So I'll keep everyone up to date with news on that on the Facebook channel and possibly elsewhere.
Great.
So thank you all. It's good to see
thank you.
And hope to see you again next month.
Yeah. Take care.
Cheers.
See you later. Bye.